"Uncle, can you be our dad?" Two street kids asked the lawyer in the square, and Richard Anderson dropped his fork on the salad plate and looked around, trying to understand where those voices were coming from. It was almost 2 in the afternoon on an ordinary Tuesday, and he had chosen that park bench specifically to have lunch in peace, away from the suffocating office and the endless calls from unhappy clients. That's when he felt a light touch on his suit sleeve. Turning around, he saw 2 boys who couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old. Their clothes were worn out, their hair unkempt, and their dirty feet in old sandals. The taller of the 2 was holding the younger one's hand tightly. "Uncle, can you be our dad?" repeated the older one, his voice trembling slightly. Richard blinked several times, trying to process what he had just heard. He looked around, hoping it was some kind of prank, or that the children's parents would appear from somewhere. But the square continued with its normal activity, people rushing by, street vendors offering their goods, retirees chatting on benches. "What's that?" he asked, his voice coming out harsher than he intended. The younger boy stepped forward, his big dark eyes fixed on Richard's face. There was something in that look that made him choke on the coffee he was drinking. It wasn't just desperation. It was a kind of hope mixed with fear of being rejected. "We need someone to be our dad," explained the older boy, speaking quickly as if afraid Richard would leave before he finished. "Just for a while, so we can go to school." "School?" Richard repeated, still trying to understand the situation. "Yeah, the school principal said she needs a guardian to sign the papers," continued the boy, "and we don't have anyone." Richard felt his chest tighten. He put the cup back on the saucer, his fingers trembling slightly. There was something terribly wrong there, but at the same time he couldn't just send the children away. "Who do you live with?" he asked, lowering his voice. The 2 boys exchanged a quick glance. The younger one bit his lower lip, as if deciding whether to tell the truth or not. "We live on the street," replied the older one, raising his chin in a gesture that tried to appear brave, but only highlighted his fragility. "For 3 months." Richard felt as if someone had punched him in the stomach. 3 months. Those children had been living on the street for 3 months. He looked at them again, this time paying attention to the details. The dirty nails, the scratches on their arms, the obvious thinness under their loose clothes. "And your parents?" he insisted, though he already knew the answer wouldn't be good. "We don't have any," said the younger one, his voice so low that Richard had to lean in to hear. "We have no one." There was a heavy silence. Richard looked at his salad plate, suddenly nauseated by the food that just minutes ago had seemed so appetizing. He thought about simply giving the children some money and going about his day. He had a hearing at 3 o'clock, documents to review, an organized life that didn't include complications like this one. But when he looked at the boys again, he saw the younger one shaking. It wasn't cold. It was a sunny October day in New York City. He was shaking from nervousness, or maybe from hunger, or both. "Have you eaten today?" he asked. They both shook their heads, no, almost in sync. Richard closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. He knew he was about to make a stupid decision, the kind his partner always said he made because he was too emotionally impulsive, but he couldn't just ignore that situation. "Okay," he said, getting up from the bench. "Let's get something to eat. There's a restaurant right there on the corner." The boy's eyes lit up in a way that made Richard feel simultaneously good and terribly bad. How had those children reached that point? As they walked through the square toward the restaurant, Richard noticed people staring, some with curiosity, others with clear disapproval. A man in an impeccable suit accompanied by 2 boys, obviously in a homeless situation, wasn't a common sight. "What are your names?" he asked while crossing the street. "I'm Michael," answered the older one, "and this here is Peter." "Michael and Peter," Richard repeated. "I'm Richard." "We already knew," said Michael. "We saw you yesterday too. You always come here for lunch." Richard stopped walking for a second, surprised. So those children had been watching him for days. He felt something strange run down his spine. Had they chosen him specifically? But why? Before he could ask, they had already reached the restaurant door. It was a simple but clean establishment, frequented mainly by office workers from the area. Richard pushed the glass door and entered, with the boys right behind him. The hostess, a middle-aged woman with hair tied in a tight bun, looked at the group, and her face immediately closed off. "Good afternoon," said Richard, using his professional tone. "Table for 3, please." The woman looked at the boys and then back at Richard, as if expecting him to be joking. "Sir, she began, hesitant. "Perhaps it would be better—" "A table for 3, repeated Richard, this time more firmly. "Is there a problem?" He knew exactly what the problem was. The woman didn't want those dirty boys inside the establishment. He felt anger rise through his chest, but forced himself to maintain composure. "It's just that—" The hostess looked around, searching for help. "Our tables are for customers who— Who what? Who pay?" Richard took his wallet from his pocket and placed a credit card on the counter harder than necessary. "These children are with me, and they will eat here. Now, if you want to discuss this, I can call my lawyer." "Oh, wait, I am a lawyer." The woman turned red and quickly grabbed 3 menus. "Right this way, please," she said, her voice tense. They followed to a table at the back of the restaurant, away from the windows. Richard noticed the woman was hiding them, but decided to let it go. For now. Michael and Peter sat side by side, looking around with a mixture of fascination and discomfort. It was obvious it had been a long time since they'd been in a place like that. "You can order whatever you want," said Richard, pushing the menus toward them. The boys opened the menus, but just stared at the pages, saying nothing. Richard realized, with a pang in his heart, that perhaps they couldn't read properly, or maybe they simply didn't know the dishes. "How about a combo meal?" he suggested, "with rice, beans, steak and fries." "Can it have 2 steaks?" asked Peter, his voice timid. "You can have as many steaks as you want," answered Richard. When the waiter came to take their order, Richard ordered 2 large combo meals and an orange juice for each boy. For himself, he ordered just coffee. He wasn't hungry anymore. While waiting for the food to arrive, Richard observed the brothers. They whispered to each other, occasionally throwing nervous glances at him, as if fearing he would change his mind and send them away. "So," began Richard, trying to sound casual, "you said you need someone to sign school papers?" Michael nodded vigorously. "We want to go back to school, but the principal said we need a responsible adult, someone who lives with us and can go to meetings." "And who did you live with before?" asked Richard, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. The boys fell silent. Peter looked at his older brother, as if waiting for him to decide how much they should tell. "We used to live in a place," said Michael, choosing his words carefully. "But we left, and we can't go back." "What kind of place?" "A place for kids who don't have families." "An orphanage, then?" Richard felt his heart tighten even more. Those boys had run away from an orphanage and were now on the streets. But why would anyone run away from a place that was supposed to be safe? Before he could ask more, the food arrived. The boys' eyes widened at the sight of the full plates. For a moment, they just stared, as if they couldn't believe it was real. "You can eat," Richard encouraged. They didn't need to be told twice. They began eating with an urgency that was painful to watch. Richard had to restrain himself from telling them to slow down, afraid they might get sick. It was obvious they hadn't had a decent meal in days, maybe weeks. As they ate, Richard kept thinking. This situation was completely out of his control. He couldn't just adopt 2 kids he found on the street. It didn't work that way. There were processes, bureaucracy, investigations, and besides, he wasn't prepared to be a father. He never had been. His wife, Catherine, had left 3 years earlier, not left in the euphemistic sense people used. She literally walked out, left a note saying she couldn't take it anymore, that she needed to find herself, that the marriage was suffocating her. Richard came home from work one day to find the apartment empty, half the things gone, and that pathetic note on the kitchen table. Since then, he'd thrown himself into work. It was easier to deal with cases and clients than with the hole Catherine left behind. And now, 3 years later, his life was exactly as he'd planned, orderly, predictable, free of emotional complications. Or at least it was, until 10 minutes ago. "How old are you?" he asked suddenly. "Michael and Peter. How old are you?" "I'm 10, Michael replied, "and Peter is 8. 10 and 8 years old. Richard tried to imagine kids that age surviving on the streets of New York City, at night when the dangers multiplied, in the cold, in the rain. He felt nauseous. "Where do you sleep?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. "Under the overpass," said Peter, his mouth full of rice. "There's a part where the rain doesn't get us much." "And is it safe?" The boys exchanged another of those silent looks. "Michael takes care of me," Peter said finally. "He doesn't let anyone hurt me." Richard looked at Michael, at that 10-year-old boy who was taking on responsibilities even adults couldn't handle. There was determination in his face, but also a deep weariness that shouldn't exist in someone so young. "And who takes care of you?" Richard asked, looking directly at Michael. The boy seemed not to understand the question at first. Then he shrugged. "I take care of myself." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. When they finished eating, the boys seemed like different versions of themselves, still dirty and disheveled, but with a life in their eyes that hadn't been there before. Richard paid the bill, ignoring the receptionist's disapproving look, and they stepped out onto the street. The afternoon sun was beating down hard. Richard looked at his watch and saw it was almost 3 o'clock. He should be at the office. He should be preparing for the hearing. But something stronger than logic kept him there, standing on the sidewalk with those 2 children. "Listen," he began, trying to find the right words. "I can't be your father. It doesn't work that way. But I can try to help somehow." The boys' faces lit up again, that glimmer of hope Richard was beginning to recognize and fear at the same time. "Can you?" asked Michael. "Really?" "I can try," repeated Richard, choosing his words carefully. "But I need to better understand your situation. Why did you run away from the shelter?" The boys exchanged glances again. Richard was starting to realize that this was their language, that silent look that communicated more than words. "They were separating us," Michael finally said, his voice low. "They said I was too old to stay in the same room as Peter. They wanted to put him with younger kids, and me with the older ones." "And that was a problem?" "Peter is afraid of the dark," explained Michael as if it were obvious. "He needs me to be there. And the other boys, they weren't nice to him." Richard crouched down, coming to eye level with the boys. Other boys were hurting Peter. Peter hid behind his brother, and that was answer enough. "Is that why you ran away, to stay together?" "We're all each other has," said Michael, and there was such conviction in his voice that Richard felt a lump in his throat. "If we get separated, it's like we lose everything all over again." Richard didn't ask what they had already lost. He didn't need to. The answer was right there, in how they clung to each other, in Michael's determination to protect his younger brother, in the fear in Peter's eyes when talking about being alone. "All right," said Richard, surprising himself. "Here's what we'll do. I know some people who work with vulnerable children. I'll call them, see what we can do. But in return, you need to promise me one thing." "What?" asked Michael, suspicious. "Promise me you won't disappear, that you'll stay around here where I can find you until we sort this out." "We promise," Michael said quickly. "And one more thing," Richard added. "You need to stop sleeping under the overpass, at least for tonight. I'm going to—" He hesitated, not believing what he was about to say. "I'm going to find a place for you to stay. Just for tonight, understand? While we get things organized." Peter's eyes filled with tears. He stepped forward and hugged Richard's leg tightly. "Thank you, mister," he murmured, his voice muffled against the suit fabric. Richard stood still, unsure what to do with his hands. Finally, he placed them awkwardly on the boy's thin shoulders. He looked at Michael and saw that his eyes were also watery, though he was trying to hide it. "Come on," said Richard, his voice a bit hoarse. "Let's first buy you some clean clothes." They walked to a department store a few blocks away. It was one of the simpler stores in the area, but still when they entered, Richard felt heads turning to look at them. A man in a suit with 2 barefoot dirty boys didn't go unnoticed. A store security guard approached them before they even reached the children's section. "Can I help you?" the man asked, but his tone wasn't helpful. "We're here to buy clothes," Richard replied, keeping his voice calm. "It's just that—" The guard looked at the boys with obvious suspicion. "These boys are known here. We've had problems before." Richard felt anger rising again. "Problems? What kind of problems?" "Minor thefts," said the guard, lowering his voice. "Look, I understand their situation, but the store has its rules." Richard looked at Michael and Peter. Michael's face was red with shame, and Peter was trembling again. It wasn't fear. It was humiliation. "I understand your rules," said Richard, his voice colder than he intended. "And I also understand the law. These children are with me and we are going to buy clothes. If you want to stop us, I suggest you call your manager. And then to your lawyer, because accusing children without proof is defamation, and doing it publicly is much worse." The security guard seemed unsure what to do. After a moment's hesitation, he stepped back. "You can go through," he said, but continued following them at a distance. Richard took the boys to the children's section. He picked out pants, t-shirts, hoodies, socks, and sneakers. He didn't ask what they wanted. He simply chose practical, durable clothes, estimating their sizes. "You'll try these on in the fitting room," he said, "and you'll come out already wearing the new clothes, understood?" The boys nodded, still quiet after the scene with the security guard. While waiting outside the fitting rooms, Richard called his partner, Marcus, and made up some excuse about a family emergency. Marcus didn't seem to fully believe it, but agreed to reschedule the meeting. When Michael and Peter came out of the fitting rooms, they were unrecognizable. The new clothes, even though simple, completely changed their appearance. They looked like normal kids, the kind you see in any park or school. Richard paid for the clothes, asked them to wrap the old ones separately, and they left the store. The security guard watched them with his eyes, but said nothing. On the street, Richard stopped and took a deep breath. What was he doing? Buying clothes for children he found on the street? Taking them to where exactly? He looked at his phone. It was almost 5 o'clock. He thought about calling some acquaintances who worked at NGOs or shelters, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the fear that they would separate the boys again, or maybe it was something deeper, something he didn't want to examine too closely. "You need to take a shower," he said finally, "and then we'll figure out what to do." "Where are we going to shower?" asked Peter, confused. Richard sighed. He knew he would regret this. "At my apartment." Richard's apartment was in a modern building in the Upper East Side neighborhood, about 20 minutes by taxi from the square where they had met. It was a discreet but elegant place, with 24-hour security and a superintendent who made it her business to know everything that happened in the building. When the taxi stopped in front of the building, Richard hesitated before getting out. Was he really doing this, bringing 2 unknown children to his apartment? But when he looked at Michael and Peter's tired faces, he couldn't turn back. The doorman, Mr. Joe, widened his eyes when he saw Richard entering with the boys. "Good afternoon, Dr. Richard," he said with a questioning tone. "Good afternoon, Mr. Joe," replied Richard, trying to sound casual. "They're my nephews. They're staying for a few days." The lie came out so naturally that Richard almost believed it himself. Mr. Joe clearly didn't believe it, but nodded and pressed the elevator button. In the elevator, Michael whispered, "We're not your nephews." "I know," replied Richard, "but it's easier this way." The apartment was on the 10th floor. When the door opened, the boys entered slowly, looking around with wide eyes. It was a spacious, minimalist space, with few furnishings but all of good quality. There was a feeling of emptiness there, as if the place were more of a showroom than a home. "You can come in," said Richard, noticing they had stopped right at the entrance, "and take off your shoes if you want to be more comfortable." But the boys didn't take off their shoes. They just stood there, looking around as if afraid to touch something and break it. "The bathroom is this way," said Richard, walking down the hallway. "You can take a shower. There are towels in the cabinet, and—" he hesitated. "There's soap and shampoo. Use as much as you want." "Can we shower together?" asked Peter, his voice small. "To save water?" Richard felt his heart tighten again. How many times had those children been scolded for using basic things? "You can shower as many times as you want," he said softly. "And you don't need to save anything here, understood?" The boys nodded and went into the bathroom. Richard stayed outside, listening to the sound of water starting to run. He leaned against the hallway wall and closed his eyes. What the hell was he doing? His phone rang. It was a message in the building's group chat. Someone, probably a nosy neighbor, had posted a picture of him entering the building with the children, with the caption, "Does anyone know who these children are that Housen 5 brought?" Richard turned off his phone without replying. He would deal with it later. Half an hour later, the boys came out of the bathroom. They were in their new clothes, their hair wet and combed. They looked even younger now, if that was possible. Richard noticed that Peter had a small scar above his left eyebrow, and Michael had an old mark on his chin. "Are you hungry?" he asked, even though they had eaten just a few hours ago. Both shook their heads no. "Are you tired?" This time they nodded. Richard took them to the guest room, a space he hardly ever used. There was a double bed with clean sheets and an empty wardrobe. "You can sleep here," he said. "And if you need anything during the night, my room is across the hall." "Can we sleep in the same bed?" asked Michael, already holding Peter's hand. "Of course you can." The boys lay down on the bed, still in their clothes. Peter curled up against his older brother, as if afraid he would disappear if he let go. Michael put a protective arm around him. "Dr. Richard?" Michael called before Richard left the room. "You can just call me Richard." "Richard, then. We won't have to leave early tomorrow, will we?" Richard looked at the two boys hugging on the bed. He should tell the truth, that this was temporary, that he needed to find a proper place for them, that he couldn't just keep two children he barely knew. But when he opened his mouth, what came out was, "No, you won't have to leave early tomorrow." "Thank you," whispered Peter, already almost asleep. Richard turned off the light and closed the door softly. In the hallway, he leaned against the wall again and ran his hands over his face. He was tired. More tired than he should be just from buying clothes and giving dinner to two children. No. The tiredness was from something else. It was from carrying the weight of those hopeful eyes, from knowing he had promised something he might not be able to keep, from feeling for the first time in 3 years that there was something in his life beyond cases and unhappy clients. He went to his room and threw himself on the bed without taking off his suit. He picked up his phone and saw that the building's group chat was on fire. There were at least 30 new messages, all speculating about the children. The building manager, Barbara, had sent a private message. "Richard, I need to speak with you urgently about the situation with the children. Building regulations, you understand." Richard didn't reply. He tossed the phone on the nightstand and closed his eyes. Tomorrow he would deal with all of it. Tomorrow he would find a solution. Tomorrow he would go back to being the organized and rational person he had always been. But that night, as he fell asleep, the last thing he thought of was the feeling of little Peter hugging his leg and saying thank you. The next morning, Richard woke up to knocks on his bedroom door. It took him a few seconds to remember where he was and why he had slept in his suit. Then everything came back at once. The boys, the square, the restaurant, the shower, the bed. The knocks continued, more insistent. "Richard," it was Michael's voice. "Are you in there?" "I'm coming," replied Richard, getting out of bed and smoothing his wrinkled clothes. When he opened the door, he found Michael and Peter there, still in their sleepwear, but with worried expressions on their faces. "We thought you had left," said Michael. "Left? I live here." "Yeah, but we weren't sure if you hadn't changed your mind overnight." Richard realized those boys were used to adults who changed their minds, who promised things and didn't deliver, who disappeared. "I haven't changed my mind," he said firmly. "Now come on, let's see what's for breakfast." The refrigerator was almost empty. Richard wasn't the type who cooked. He usually ate out or ordered delivery. He found sliced bread, butter, and a bit of orange juice. It wasn't much, but it would do. While the boys ate, he called the office and said he'd only arrive later. Marcus didn't ask any questions, which meant he was probably annoyed but decided to leave it for later. "Listen," said Richard, sitting at the table with the boys. "Today I need to go to work, but first, let's sort some things out. You said you need someone to sign school papers, right? The two nodded. So let's go to the school and talk to the principal. See exactly what's needed. Really? Michael's eyes lit up. We can go back to school? Let's see what we can do. After breakfast, Richard took a quick shower and put on a clean suit. The boys were waiting in the living room, sitting right on the edge of the sofa, as if afraid to wrinkle it. The school was in a more distant neighborhood in Queens, New York City. It was a simple but well-kept building with bars on the windows and a small playground. On the taxi ride, Richard asked how they had studied there before. We used to live nearby, explained Michael, before everything changed. And what changed? Richard knew he was pushing, but he needed to understand. Michael looked out the taxi window, as if the words were out there somewhere. Our mom. She's not here anymore, he finally said. It's been almost a year. Richard didn't ask anything else. He didn't need to. Those boys had lost their mother, been placed in a shelter, been separated, run away, and were now living on the streets, all in less than a year. At the school, the principal was a woman in her 50s with graying hair pulled into a ponytail and tired eyes behind prescription glasses. She looked at the group in surprise when they entered the room. Michael, Peter, she said, rising from her chair. Boys, where have you been? I called the shelter several times. They were with me, said Richard, extending his hand. Richard Anderson, I'm a lawyer. The principal shook his hand hesitantly. A lawyer? Do the boys have any legal problems? No, it's not that. Richard hesitated, not quite knowing how to explain the situation. I'm taking care of them temporarily, and they told me they'd like to return to school. The principal looked at the boys, and then back at Richard, clearly confused. Mr. Anderson, with all due respect, but there are procedures for this sort of thing. The boys can't just come back without proper documentation. We need a legal guardian, proof of residence, updated vaccination records. I understand the procedures, interrupted Richard, and I'm willing to provide all that. I just need to know exactly what's required. The principal sighed and sat back down, motioning for everyone to sit as well. Look, Mr. Anderson, I don't know exactly what your relationship is with these children. He's going to be our dad, said Peter suddenly, his voice clear and confident. Everyone turned to look at the boy. Richard felt his face grow warm. Peter, it's not exactly like that. But you said you'd take care of us, insisted Peter, his eyes wide. A dad takes care of his kids, doesn't he? Richard didn't know what to say. He looked at the principal, who now seemed even more confused. Mr. Anderson, she said slowly, are you trying to adopt these children? No, I mean... Richard ran his hand through his hair, frustrated. I'm just trying to help. They need to go back to school. I understand your intention. The principal clasped her hands on the desk. But there's a system for this. The boys ran away from a shelter. The right thing would be to return them there, where there are trained people to handle their situation. No. Michael stood up suddenly. We're not going back there. Michael? The principal used a softer tone. I know it was hard, but the shelter is the safest place for you right now. They separate us. Michael's voice came out louder than he intended. They put Peter with kids who hit him. I won't allow it. A heavy silence fell over the room. The principal looked at Richard with an expression that mixed understanding and helplessness. Mr. Anderson, she said finally, if you really want to help these children, you need to do things the right way. Talk to the Child Protective Services. Start a custody process. But you can't just take children out of the system and keep them. This could bring serious problems for you and for them. Richard knew she was right. All of that was irregular, illegal even. As a lawyer, he knew the consequences of kidnapping minors, even with good intentions. But when he looked at the desperate faces of the boys, he couldn't simply hand them back to the system that had failed them. What if I start the custody process? He asked. In the meantime, can they study here? The principal hesitated. If you get a temporary authorization from Child Protective Services, yes. But without it, my hands are tied. Richard nodded, already knowing what his next step would be. Thank you for your time, he said, standing up. I'll take care of the legal procedures and come back here." Outside the school, Michael and Peter were quiet, their shoulders slumped. It was obvious they were disappointed. "Don't give up yet," said Richard, crouching down to their level. "I promised I would help, and I will, but I need to do it the right way, understood? And if the right way doesn't work?" asked Michael, his voice heavy with distrust that came from many broken promises. "It will work," said Richard with more conviction than he felt. "I'll make it work." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. On the way back to the apartment, Richard called a friend who worked in family and child law. Michelle answered on the third ring. "Richard, long time. How are you?" "Good, Michelle. Look, I need urgent professional advice." "Of course, go ahead." Richard explained the whole situation from the meeting in the square to the conversation with the principal. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Richard," said Michelle finally, "you understand this could go very wrong, right?" "I know. But I can't just abandon these children." "No one is asking you to abandon them. But there are processes. You can't just decide to care for 2 children who ran away from the system. Technically, you're committing unlawful custody of minors." "What if I start a custody process? It could take months, years even, and there's no guarantee you'll get it. They need to assess your financial situation, emotional state, your background." "My background?" Richard felt a tightness in his chest. "What kind of background?" "Anything. Legal problems, debts, addictions, unstable relationships. They'll investigate everything." Richard thought of Catherine, of how she left. Would that count against him? Would they say he wasn't emotionally stable because of a failed marriage? "Michelle, even so, I want to try." She sighed. "Then come to my office tomorrow. I'll help you file the paperwork. But Richard, be prepared. This won't be easy. And the children will need to return to the shelter while the process is underway." "No." Richard looked at the back seat of the taxi, where Michael and Peter were sitting, looking out the window. "I won't let that happen. Richard, thanks for your help, Michelle. I'll see you tomorrow." He hung up before she could argue further. Back at the apartment, Richard found a notice stuck to the door. It was from the building manager, Barbara, summoning him to an emergency condo meeting to discuss the irregular situation in apartment 1005. "What irregular situation?" asked Peter, reading over Richard's shoulder. "Nothing you need to worry about," Richard replied, crumpling the paper and throwing it in the trash. But truthfully, he was worried. Barbara was the type who took condo rules very seriously, and technically, there was a clause in the bylaws about not keeping unregistered people in the apartment for more than 3 days without notifying the management. Inside the apartment, the boys went straight to the room where they had been sleeping. Richard followed them and found them sitting on the bed, quiet and thoughtful. "Are you guys okay?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. "We're not going to be able to go to school, are we?" said Michael, not looking at him. "Yes, you will. It's just going to take a little while." "Everyone always says that." Michael's voice was heavy with a weariness that didn't match his age. "That it's going to take a little while, that we just have to wait, but nothing ever happens." Richard entered the room and sat in the chair beside the bed. "Michael, I'm not everyone. When I promise something, I keep it." "Our dad used to promise too," Peter said softly. "He promised he would stop drinking. He promised he would get a job. He promised he would take care of us. But he never did." It was the first time they had mentioned their father. Richard leaned forward. "And where is your father now?" "We don't know," Michael replied. After she left, he disappeared too. He showed up a few times at the shelter saying he was going to get us out of there, but he never did. Then he stopped showing up. Richard felt anger toward this man he had never met. What kind of father abandoned his children in a shelter and disappeared? "Listen," he said, choosing his words carefully. "I'm not going to lie to you. I don't know if this is going to work. I don't know if I can be the father you need, but I'm going to try. With everything I have, I'm going to try. And even if it doesn't work, even if things don't turn out the way we want, I promise I won't just disappear. Understood?" The boys looked at him with those big, vulnerable eyes. Richard realized they wanted to believe him. But they were also afraid. Afraid to believe and be disappointed again. "Now," said Richard, getting up from the chair, "let's think about what to do today. You can't stay locked up here in the apartment. You need to get out, get some fresh air." "Can we go to the park?" asked Peter, his eyes lighting up for the first time since they left school. "Which park?" "There's a park near the school, where we used to play before." Richard looked at his watch. It was past noon. He should be at the office. Marcus was probably about to have a fit, but when he looked at the hopeful faces of the boys, he knew the office could wait. "Let's go to the park then." The park was about 20 minutes away by bus. It was a simple public space, with some old but still functional playground equipment, wooden benches under leafy trees, and a makeshift soccer field where boys were playing with a flat ball. When they arrived, Michael and Peter ran straight to the swings. Richard sat on a nearby bench, watching. It was strange to see how they were just children at that moment, not survivors of the streets, not traumatized orphans, just two boys swinging and laughing. "Look, Richard," shouted Peter, swinging higher and higher. "Look how high I can go." Richard waved, feeling something strange in his chest. It wasn't exactly happiness. It was more like relief mixed with fear. Relief at seeing the boys being children, fear of not being able to hold on to that moment. His phone rang. It was Marcus. "Where are you?" His partner's voice was tense. "You missed 2 meetings today and didn't answer any of my calls." "Marcus, sorry, I had..." "Some things came up." "What kind of things?" "Richard, you can't just disappear like this. We have clients, deadlines, responsibilities." I know. But it's just..." Richard stopped talking, watching Michael gently push Peter's swing, both laughing at something he couldn't hear from here. "It's complicated," he said finally, "but I'll handle it. I just need a few days." "A few days?" Marcus sounded incredulous. "Richard, what's going on with you?" "I'll explain later. Just trust me, okay?" He hung up before Marcus could respond. He knew he was being unfair. The firm belonged to both of them, built with years of hard work. But at that moment, he couldn't think about contracts and lawsuits. He could only think about the 2 children who depended on him. After an hour at the park, they left. The boys were tired but happy, a kind of simple happiness Richard hadn't seen in anyone for a long time. On the way back, they passed a bakery. Peter stopped in front of the window, looking at the pastries with shining eyes. "Do you want something?" asked Richard. "Can I?" Peter's voice was small, as if he was used to not being allowed to want anything. "Of course you can." They entered the bakery and Peter chose a cream puff. Michael said he didn't want anything, but Richard bought one for him too, along with bread, milk, ham, cheese, fruit, and everything else that could make his apartment a place where children could live. When they got back to the building, Barbara was waiting in the lobby. "Richard," she approached with firm steps, "I need to speak with you." "Barbara, it's not a good time." "It won't take long." She cast a glance at the boys. "It's about the building regulations. Are you aware there are rules about temporary residence?" "I'm aware." "And are you aware you need to notify the administration about anyone staying in your apartment for more than 3 days?" "Barbara, these children need a place to stay. I'm handling the situation legally, but it takes time." "I understand your situation." Her tone was firm but not cruel. "But the other residents are concerned. Some have raised questions about safety." Richard felt anger rising. "Safety? They're children, Barbara, not criminals." "I know that. But you understand that as the board president, I have to listen to all residents. Some suggested it might be better for you to find another place for them to stay until you resolve the legal situation." "I won't do that." "Richard." "Barbara, with all due respect, I've lived here for 5 years. I've always paid my fees on time, never caused problems. I'm just asking for a little patience while I sort this out. Can I count on you?" Barbara sighed, looking at the boys who stood quietly behind Richard, hugging the bakery bags. "I'll try to hold off the board for a few days," she said finally. "But Richard, you need to resolve this quickly, and you need to officially notify me about the children. Paperwork, you understand." "I understand. Thank you, Barbara." In the apartment, while the boys ate their cream puffs, Richard kept thinking. He had a few days. A few days to resolve a situation that normally took months or years. How was he going to do this? His phone rang again. This time it was a number he didn't recognize. Hello? Mr. Richard Anderson? It was a female, professional voice. Yes. My name is Amanda Smith. I'm a social worker at the New Hope House shelter. I'm calling about Michael and Peter Cooper. We were informed they might be with you. Richard felt his heart race. Who informed you of this? The principal of the school they attended. Mr. Anderson, the children ran away from our institution 3 months ago. We need them to return immediately. They're not coming back, Richard said before thinking. Sir, with all due respect, you have no legal authority over these children. If you don't return them voluntarily, we'll have to take legal action. Try. Richard surprised himself with the coldness in his own voice. I'm a lawyer, I know my rights, and these children came to me of their own free will. I'm not keeping them against their will. They're minors. They can't decide where they want to stay. So the system decides for them, the same system that separated them and allowed them to suffer abuse. There was silence on the other end. Mr. Anderson, Amanda's voice came out softer now. I understand you think you're helping, but there are protocols. If you truly care about these children, you'll want them placed in the safest and most appropriate place. And that place isn't the shelter, said Richard, at least not until I'm sure they'll stay together and safe. Are you willing to start a custody process? I am. Then do it. But until the process is official, you're technically committing a crime by keeping them with you. Write down my address, said Richard, and gave the details. If you want to get the children, come, but you'll need a court order, and I guarantee I'll fight any attempt to separate them again. He hung up, his hands trembling slightly. He knew he had just made the situation much worse, but he couldn't bring himself to regret it. When he returned to the living room, Michael was looking at him with a worried expression. They're going to come get us, aren't they? Richard saw no point in lying. They'll try, but I won't let them. Not without a fight. Why are you doing this? Asked Michael, his voice full of emotion. You don't even know us. Richard thought about the question. Why was he doing this? Why was he risking his career, his reputation, his organized life, for 2 children he had met just 2 days ago? He thought about Catherine, about how she said he was incapable of true connections, about how he had closed himself off over the past 3 years, living only for work, avoiding anything that could hurt him. He thought about how his life had become empty, an apartment full of expensive furniture but no soul. And then he thought of Peter's hopeful eyes when he asked if he could have a piece of candy. The way Michael protected his brother, even though he was so young. How the two hugged each other that first night, as if the other was all they had in the world. Because you reminded me there's more to life than lawsuits and money, he said finally. And because I was abandoned once too. And I know how much it hurts. Michael said nothing, but Richard saw tears forming in the boy's eyes. They weren't tears of sadness. They were of relief, of finally having someone who understood. That night, Richard made dinner. It wasn't anything special, just pasta with tomato sauce, but the boys ate as if it were the best meal they had ever tasted. Afterwards, they watched a movie on TV, the 3 of them sitting on the couch. Peter fell asleep halfway through, his head resting on Richard's arm. When he went to put the boys to bed, Michael said, "Richard, thank you for everything." "You don't have to thank me." "Yes, I do. No one ever fought for us before." Richard felt his throat tighten. "I'll keep fighting, I promise." After the boys fell asleep, Richard stayed awake in the living room thinking about what to do. Amanda was right. He was technically committing a crime. He could lose his lawyer's license. He could even be arrested. But when he thought about the alternative, about returning the boys to a system that had failed them, he couldn't do it. He simply couldn't. In the morning, Richard woke up to noises coming from the kitchen. He went to check and found Michael trying to make breakfast. There were burnt toast on the plate and spilled juice on the counter. "Sorry," Michael said quickly. "I wanted to help, but I made a mess." "It's okay." Richard grabbed a cloth and started cleaning the juice. "It's just, you don't need to do this, you can just be kids here." "But we want to help," insisted Michael. We don't want to just receive things and give nothing back." Richard stopped cleaning and looked at the boy. He looked so serious, so determined to prove his worth, as if he believed he needed to pay his way for everything he received. "Michael, look at me," said Richard, crouching down to his level. "You don't need to pay your way for anything. You don't need to earn care or food or a place to sleep. These things are your rights. Understand?" Michael looked at him with teary eyes. "But everyone always said we were too much trouble, that we were expensive, that if we didn't behave properly, they would separate us." The anger Richard felt at that moment was different from anything he had ever felt. It was a cold, determined anger against all the adults who had failed these children, who made them believe they needed to pay their way to be loved. "Well, here it doesn't work like that," he said, putting his hands on Michael's shoulders. "Here you can make a mess, you can make mistakes, you can burn toast, and you'll still have food, a bed, and care. Because that's what children deserve. No conditions." Michael suddenly hugged Richard, crying against his chest. Richard froze for a moment before hugging him back, feeling the small body tremble with sobs. When Peter woke up, he found the two still hugging in the kitchen. He didn't say anything, just joined the hug, and the three stood there for a few minutes, an improvised family forming amid the chaos. Later that day, Richard went to Michelle's office. She greeted him with a worried expression. "Do you really want to do this?" she asked, after he explained the whole situation. "I need to do this. Richard, it's going to be hard, very hard. You're single. You have a history of a failed marriage. You work long hours. You live in a small apartment for 3 people. They won't make this easy for you. I know, but I need to try." Michelle sighed and opened a folder. "Then let's get started. First, I need all your documents. Then we'll have to do a psychological evaluation of you, an evaluation of your apartment, interviews with neighbors and co-workers. How long will it take? With luck and a lot of effort, 6 months? Maybe a year. And where will the children stay during this time? Officially, they should go back to the shelter. They're not going back. Richard, Michelle, I know what the law says, but I also know there are loopholes. There are ways to get temporary custody while the process is ongoing. You know these ways." Michelle leaned back in her chair, looking at him for a long moment. "If I do this, I'll be risking my career too." "I know, and I won't ask if you're not comfortable. But Michelle, these children have no one. If we send them back to the shelter, they'll separate them, and after everything they've been through, I don't know if they'll survive that." She stayed silent, her fingers drumming on the desk. "Let me see what I can do," she said finally, "but no promises." Richard returned home with a mixture of hope and fear. Michelle was going to try to help, but even so, there were no guarantees. And at any moment, the social worker could show up with a court order. When she arrived at the apartment, she found the boys playing with old cards they had found in a drawer. They looked so normal, so happy in that moment, that Richard felt his chest tighten. "How did it go?" asked Michael, clearly nervous. "It went well. We're on the right track. But will we still have to go back?" Richard hesitated. He didn't want to lie, but he also didn't want to take away their hope. "I'll do everything I can to avoid that," he said honestly. "But I need to be straight with you. It might happen, temporarily." Michael's face closed off. "I knew it. I knew this would happen again. Michael, no!" The boy stood up, cards falling to the floor. "Everyone always says the same thing, that it'll be temporary, that it'll be different. But in the end, we always end up alone. Michael, it's not like that." "Ah, yes, it is." Tears were streaming down his face now. "You're just like all the others. You promise things you can't deliver." The words hurt because there was some truth in them. Richard had promised to take care of them, but had so little control over the situation. How could he promise anything when the whole system was against them? "You're right," said Richard, surprising Michael. "I promise things I don't know if I can deliver, and that wasn't fair of me, but that doesn't mean I won't try. I'll fight for you with everything I have, and even if they try to separate you, I'll keep fighting. You can call me an idiot. You can say I'm like the others, but I won't give up, understand?" Michael looked at him, trying to understand if he could trust those words. "And if you lose, if they take us anyway, then I'll appeal, and I'll appeal again, and I'll keep appealing until there are no options left. And even if all legal doors close, I'll find another way. Because you're not just a case to me, Michael. You're—" He hesitated, searching for the right words. "You're important to me, really." Michael stood still for a moment. Then, slowly, he sat back down on the floor and began picking up the cards again. He didn't say anything, but Richard saw that something had changed. Maybe not complete trust, but it was a start. In the following days, Richard established a routine. He woke up early, made breakfast with the boys, brought some work home to be with them, and in the evening they had dinner together and watched TV. It was simple, but it worked. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. The problem came when Marcus decided to show up at the apartment unannounced. Richard was in the kitchen helping Peter with a drawing when the doorbell rang. "Who is it?" he asked through the intercom. "It's me. We need to talk." Richard hesitated but ended up pressing the button to let him in. A few minutes later, Marcus was at the door with an expression that mixed worry and irritation. "So," he said, entering without waiting for an invitation, "this is why you've been missing." He looked at Michael and Peter, who were now quiet in the living room, clearly uncomfortable with the presence of a stranger. "Marcus, this isn't the best time." "Richard, are you crazy?" Marcus lowered his voice, but his tone was harsh. "You picked up 2 kids from the street and brought them to your home. Do you have any idea of the legal trouble this could cause?" "I have every idea. I'm a lawyer, remember?" "Then why are you doing this?" Richard looked at the boys and then back at Marcus. "Because it was the right thing to do." "The right thing?" "Richard, listen to yourself. This isn't a case you can solve with logic and arguments. These are children. Real children, with real problems. Are you prepared for this?" "I don't know," admitted Richard, "but I'm trying." Marcus ran his hand over his face, clearly frustrated. "Look, I understand you want to help, but this is affecting the office. You've missed important meetings, missed deadlines, ignored clients. It can't go on like this. So what do you suggest? That I abandon these children? I'm not saying that. I'm saying you need to find a balance or have other people take care of them while you work. But you can't just stop living your life." "This is my life now," said Richard, and realized it was true. In just a few days, those boys had become his life, more real and important than any client or case. Marcus sighed heavily. "I hope you know what you're doing." After he left, Michael approached Richard. "Is he right? Are we messing up your work?" "No." Richard put his hand on the boy's shoulder. "You're not messing up anything. Marcus is just worried, but I'll fix this." But fixing it wasn't so simple. In the following days, Richard realized Marcus was right about one thing. It was impossible to care for 2 children and maintain his workload. He started arriving late to meetings, turning in documents past deadlines, losing focus on important cases. And the clients noticed. One by one, they began to complain. Some threatened to take their cases to other firms. Marcus had several tense conversations with Richard about the situation. At the same time, the bureaucracy to get temporary custody was dragging on. Michelle had managed to delay the boys' return to the shelter for a few weeks, but not indefinitely. And the social worker, Amanda, was becoming increasingly insistent. "Mr. Anderson," she said in one of many calls, "I understand your position, but I need to visit the children. I need to assess the situation. It's protocol. When do you want to come?" "Tomorrow, at 2 in the afternoon." Richard agreed, although he knew that visit could change everything. If Amanda decided the children weren't in a suitable environment, she could take them immediately. That night, he explained the situation to Michael and Peter. "A woman is coming here tomorrow," he said. "She works with children and will ask some questions. It's important that you're honest, but also—" He hesitated. "I also want you to know that no matter what happens, I haven't given up on you." "Is she going to take us away?" asked Peter, his voice trembling. "I don't know, but if she tries, I'll fight." The next morning, Richard cleaned the apartment from top to bottom. He bought more food, organized the rooms, tried to make the place look like a proper home for children. But while doing it, he couldn't stop thinking, what if it wasn't enough? At 2 o'clock sharp, the doorbell rang. Richard opened the door to find a woman in her 40s, hair tied in a bun, professional but not intimidating clothes. Amanda Smith had a face that had seen a lot and learned not to judge quickly. "Mr. Anderson," she extended her hand. "Thank you for having me. Please come in." Amanda entered, her eyes scanning the apartment. Richard saw when she noticed Peter's drawings on the refrigerator, the children's books he had bought stacked in the corner, the small sneakers by the door. "Are the children here?" she asked. "They're in the room. I'll call them." Michael and Peter came out slowly, clearly nervous. Amanda smiled at them in a way that seemed genuine. "Hi, boys. Do you remember me?" They nodded. "I'd like to talk with you if that's okay. It can be here or somewhere more private." "We can talk in the room," said Michael, looking at Richard as if asking for permission. "Of course," Richard agreed, although he felt his stomach churn. Amanda spent an hour in the room with the boys. Richard stayed in the living room, unable to concentrate on anything. What were they saying? Would she understand their situation? Or would she just see things from a bureaucratic perspective? When they finally came out, the boys went straight to Richard and stayed close to him. Amanda made some notes on her clipboard before speaking. "Mr. Anderson, may I speak with you privately?" They went to the balcony. The afternoon was hot, the sun beating down hard on the city concrete. "The children spoke very highly of you," Amanda began. "But—" Richard knew that tone. There was always a but. "But my concern isn't whether they like you. It's whether this is best for them in the long run. You work long hours, live in a small apartment, have no experience with children, and just got out of a marriage." "Just got out? It's been 3 years. In the context of custody processes, 3 years is recent. They'll question your emotional stability." "My emotional stability is fine. As for the rest, I can change my workload. I can look for a larger apartment. Those things have solutions." Amanda looked at him for a long moment. "May I ask a personal question?" "Go ahead." "Why are you doing this? Don't give me the automatic answer that you want to help. I want to know the truth. Why have 2 children you barely know become so important?" Richard thought about the question. It was the same one he'd been asking himself since day one. "Because when my wife left," he said slowly, "she said I was incapable of true connections, that I hid behind work because I was afraid to really feel anything, and for 3 years I proved her right. I stopped feeling, connecting, caring, until I met Michael and Peter, and when they looked at me with those eyes full of hope and fear, I felt something. For the first time in 3 years, I felt my life had a purpose beyond winning cases and making money." Amanda said nothing for a moment. "You know feelings aren't enough? That good intentions don't guarantee a suitable home?" "I know. But I also know these children need someone who will fight for them. And I'm willing to be that person." Amanda sighed and put away her clipboard. "I'll be honest with you. The shelter isn't ideal. We have overcrowding problems, staff shortages, and yes, there have been incidents of aggression among the children. But it's what we have. It's the system. And technically it's where these children should be. And in practice?" "In practice," she hesitated. "In practice, I see 2 children who finally seem to be in a safe place, where they're eating well, sleeping in clean beds, and most importantly, where they're together. So I'll give a favorable recommendation for temporary custody. But Mr. Anderson, this isn't permanent. I'll have to come here every week. I'll have to constantly evaluate. And any sign that things aren't working, I'll have to take them. Understood?" Richard felt as if a huge weight had lifted from his shoulders. "Understood. Thank you." "Thank you very much. Don't thank me yet. The process will still be long and difficult, and there's one more thing." "What?" "The children's biological father." Richard felt his stomach sink. "The father? I thought he had disappeared." "He had, but it seems he's resurfaced. He contacted the shelter a few days ago saying he wants his children back." "He can't do that. He abandoned them. Legally, he still has parental rights. Unless we prove he's unfit, which will be difficult. He's been through rehabilitation, has been clean for 6 months, has a job. On paper, he seems to have changed. And in practice? In practice, I don't know, but it's something you need to be prepared to face. After Amanda left, Richard sat in the living room processing the information. He had obtained temporary custody, which was a victory. But now there was a new problem: the biological father. Michael and Peter realized something was wrong. "What is it?" asked Michael. "Did the woman say we have to go back?" "No, you can stay, at least for now." "Then why do you have that look?" Richard hesitated. Should he tell them about their father? But he decided they deserved to know the truth. "Your father showed up. He's saying he wants you back." The reaction was immediate. Michael's face turned pale and Peter started trembling. "No," said Michael, his voice sounding strange. "We're not going. He can't make us." "Michael! You don't understand," the boy was almost shouting now. "You don't know what he's like. When he's been drinking, he—" He stopped, shaking. "He becomes different, scary." Richard sat on the floor, getting to the boy's level. "Did he hit you?" Michael looked away. "Not me, but he hit Mum. And when she wasn't here anymore, he started yelling at us. A lot. And once he almost—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Peter was crying silently now. Richard pulled them into a hug. "He won't lay a hand on you," he promised. "Not while I'm still breathing." But making that promise was one thing. Keeping it was something completely different. In the following days, Richard dove into research. He talked with Michelle about how to challenge the father's parental rights. He discovered they would need to prove he posed a danger to the children, but without concrete evidence of abuse, it would be difficult. And then, a week later, the father showed up. It was a Saturday afternoon. Richard was in the kitchen trying to teach the boys how to make pancakes when the doorbell rang. Michael and Peter immediately froze. "It's him," said Michael, his voice barely audible. "I know it's him." Richard went to the intercom. The image showed a man around 35, thin, with deep dark circles under his eyes but wearing clean clothes. "Yes? My name is Frank Cooper. I'm the father of Michael and Peter. I need to speak with my sons." Richard took a deep breath. "Mr. Cooper, the children are under my temporary custody at the moment. Any visits need to be scheduled and supervised." "They're my children. Can't I just see them?" "Not without legal permission. I'm sorry. At least let me talk to them, please. I just want them to know I've changed, that I'm better." Richard looked back. Michael and Peter were hugging each other, both trembling. The sight made something inside him harden. "Not today, Mr. Cooper. Contact the social worker and schedule a proper visit. You can't keep me from seeing my kids." "I can and I will, until a judge says otherwise. Good afternoon." Richard hung up the intercom, but the man kept ringing the bell, insistent, desperate. Finally, after a few minutes, it stopped. Richard returned to the kitchen. The boys were exactly where he left them, still hugging, still trembling. "He's gone," said Richard gently, "and he won't come back without permission." "Do you promise?" asked Peter, his voice small. "I promise." But that night, while the boys slept, Richard lay awake thinking. Frank Cooper seemed determined, and despite everything the boys had said, legally he still had rights. How could Richard protect them from someone the law still considered their father? The answer came a few days later, from an unexpected source. Richard was at the office, finally trying to catch up on work, when he received a call from an unknown number. "Hello? Mr. Anderson? My name is Helen Cooper. I'm Frank's mother, the grandmother of Michael and Peter." Richard straightened in his chair. "Mrs. Cooper, how can I help you?" "I heard my grandsons are with you, and that Frank is trying to get them back." "He is." There was a long pause. When Helen spoke again, her voice was heavy with emotion. "Mr. Anderson, I can't let this happen. Frank is my son, and I love him, but he's not ready to care for these children. Maybe he never will be." "Do you have evidence of this?" "I do. Medical records from when my daughter-in-law was hospitalized with injuries, reports from the AA meetings Frank attended, and and my own observations as a mother who watched her son sink lower and lower. Why are you calling me? Because someone needs to speak up for these children's safety, and I couldn't do that when my daughter-in-law was still here. I won't fail again. Richard scheduled a meeting with Helen for the next day. When she appeared, she was a woman in her 60s, with greying hair, trembling hands, but determined eyes. She carried a folder full of documents. I kept everything, she said, placing the folder on the table. Every time my daughter-in-law called me crying. Every time Frank promised to change and didn't. Every hospital record. Richard flipped through the documents, his heart growing heavier with each page. There were emergency reports, photos of bruises, statements from neighbors. It was worse than he had imagined. Why did you never report it? He asked. Helen lowered her eyes. Because he's my son, and I had hope that he would change. But after my daughter-in-law was gone, she stopped, wiping away tears. After that, I realized my hesitation cost a life. I won't let it cost 2 more. Can I use this? That's why I'm here. With those documents, Michelle managed to build a strong case against Frank. A hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. It would be Richard's chance to prove that Frank shouldn't get the children back. But 3 weeks was a long time, and Frank was growing increasingly desperate. He started showing up at the building regularly. Sometimes he tried to convince the doorman to let him upstairs. Other times he stayed outside waiting for the children to come out. Richard had to start using the garage to avoid confrontations. The boys were getting more and more scared. Peter started having nightmares, waking up in the middle of the night screaming. Michael developed a nervous tic, constantly looking out the window, checking if his father was there. He's going to take us, Michael said one night, after another of Peter's nightmares. I know he will. It's like the other times. Everyone promises they'll protect us, but in the end he always gets what he wants. Not this time, said Richard, though he wasn't as sure as he sounded. This time we have evidence. We have witnesses. We have your grandmother on our side. Our grandmother? Peter lifted his head. We have a grandmother? That's when Richard realized the boys didn't know, that no one had told them about Helen. You do, he said, and she's helping us. Why did she never show up before? Asked Michael, his voice hard. If she cared, why did she leave us on the street? She didn't know where you were, but she's here now, and she wants to meet you. The boys fell silent, processing the information. Finally, Michael said, We want to meet her too. The meeting was scheduled for the following Sunday. Helen came to the apartment bringing homemade cakes and old photos. When she saw her grandchildren, she started crying. Michael, Peter, she said, her voice choked. You've grown so much. The boys were shy at first, but gradually, as Helen told stories about their mother, they began to open up. Peter showed her his drawings. Michael asked questions about his father, trying to understand how the man he knew had once been the boy in those photos. Your father was different when he was a child, explained Helen, but things changed, and I didn't help the way I should have. That's why I'm here now, to do what's right, even if it's late. After the boys went to play in the room, Helen spoke with Richard. Thank you, she said, for taking care of them when no one else did. No need to thank me. Yes, I do. And I need to ask you something. What happens after the hearing? If we manage to take away Frank's rights, where will they go? Richard didn't have a simple answer for that. I'm trying to get permanent custody, but it's a long process. And if you don't succeed, then they'll go up for adoption, and they'll probably be separated because finding someone willing to adopt 2 older siblings is difficult, Helen completed. I know. I've looked into it. She was silent for a moment. Mr. Anderson, I don't have much. A small pension, a 1-bedroom apartment. But if I could keep them. You want custody? I want to try. They're my grandchildren. I've already failed them once. But if they give me a second chance... Richard felt conflicting emotions. On one hand, he knew biological family had priority. On the other, he had grown attached to the boys in a way he hadn't expected. The thought of losing them hurt more than he thought possible. But when he looked at Helen, he saw a woman carrying the weight of past mistakes, desperately trying to make them right. And he realized that maybe the answer didn't have to be one or the other. Maybe it could be both. What if we worked together? He suggested. Shared custody. They could have both you and me. A grandmother and a... He hesitated. And someone who cares. Helen's eyes filled with tears again. You would do that? Even though you don't have to? I would. For them. The idea of shared custody wasn't conventional, but Michelle thought it could work, especially with Helen's history of helping the case against Frank. The hearing finally arrived. Richard dressed in his best suit, but inside he was a mess of nerves. Helen was equally nervous, clutching her purse tightly. Michael and Peter stayed home with a babysitter Richard had hired. It was better that way. They didn't need to hear the sordid details of what their father had done. Frank was there, accompanied by a public defender. He looked better than the last time Richard had seen him, cleaner, more presentable. But when his eyes met Richard's, there was a rage there that reminded Richard why he was fighting. The hearing lasted hours. Frank's lawyer argued that he had changed, that he was clean, that he deserved a second chance with his children. He presented rehabilitation certificates, recommendation letters from his employer, therapy reports. But then Michelle began presenting the evidence, the medical records, the photos, Helen's testimony, who cried as she spoke about how many times she saw her daughter-in-law injured, how many times Frank promised to change and didn't. And then came Richard's testimony. He spoke about the state of the children when he found them, about Peter's nightmares, about the fear in Michael's eyes when he learned his father had shown up, about how 2 children shouldn't carry so much trauma. The judge, a man in his 50s with a tired expression, listened to everything in silence. When the testimonies ended, he called for a recess to consider his decision. The hours of waiting were torturous. Richard and Helen sat in the hallway, not talking much, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, they were called back. The judge had a serious expression when he began to speak. "This is a difficult case," he said. "On one side, we have a father who claims to have changed and deserves a second chance. On the other, we have children who have clearly suffered significant trauma and are afraid of their biological father." Richard held his breath. "However," the judge continued, "my duty is not to protect the feelings of adults. It is to protect the well-being of children. And based on the evidence presented, I believe that Frank Cooper, despite his rehabilitation efforts, still represents a potential risk to Michael and Peter." Frank stood up, beginning to protest, but the judge raised his hand. "Mr. Cooper, you will be entitled to supervised visits, but primary custody will be granted to Richard Anderson and Helen Cooper under a shared custody arrangement. The children will reside primarily with Mr. Anderson, with regular visits to Mrs. Cooper. Both will have legal responsibility for the children." Richard felt his legs weaken. They had succeeded. They really had succeeded. Beside him, Helen was crying, but this time they were tears of relief. Across the room, Frank stood still, his face red with anger and humiliation. His lawyer was trying to calm him down, but he shook him off abruptly and left the room, slamming the door. "Mr. Anderson, Mrs. Cooper," said the judge, looking at them, "do you understand that this is a great responsibility? These children will need a lot of support, therapy, patience. It won't be easy." "We understand," they replied together. "Then may God help you. And more importantly, may they help these children have the childhood they deserve." The paperwork took a few more hours. When they finally left the courthouse, the sun was already setting. Richard called the babysitter, letting her know they were on their way back. "How did it go?" she asked. "The boys are asking." "It worked," said Richard, his voice faltering a bit. "It worked." At the apartment, when he opened the door, he was greeted by 2 small rockets, who threw themselves at him with enough force to almost knock him over. "So?" asked Michael, his eyes shining with hope and fear. "What did the judge say?" Richard crouched down, getting to their level. "He said you're going to stay with me, and with Grandma Helen too, officially, legally, forever if you want." The silence that followed was broken by a joyful shout from Peter. Michael, always more reserved, just hugged Richard tightly, trembling slightly. "Is it for real?" he whispered. "Not temporary. It's for real." That night, after a celebratory dinner with Helen, after putting the boys to bed, Richard sat alone in the living room. He looked around the apartment that just months ago was just an empty space full of expensive furniture. Now there were toys on the floor, drawings on the refrigerator, small sneakers by the door. There was life there. His phone rang. It was Marcus. "So," said his partner, "I heard you won." "We won. Me and the children's grandmother." "Marcus, about the office, I know. You can't keep up with the same workload, that's why I'm calling. I found another partner. Someone who can take on some of your cases. You'll stay at the firm, but with fewer hours, so you can take care of the kids." Richard was surprised. "You would do that?" "I'm not doing it out of kindness," said Marcus, but there was a softer tone in his voice. "I'm doing it because I've seen how important this is to you, and because, honestly, you seem more alive now than in the last 3 years. The kids have been good for you." "Thank you, Marcus. Just don't make me regret it." The following months were about adjustments. Helen moved to a smaller apartment in the same building, and the boys spent weekends with her. During the week, they stayed with Richard. It was Helen who taught Richard how to cook real food, not just the basics. It was she who showed him how to comb Peter's hair without hurting him. It was she who stayed with them when Richard needed to travel for work. It wasn't always easy. Peter continued to have nightmares for months. Michael had anger outbursts when he felt overwhelmed. There were times when Richard questioned if he was doing the right thing, if he was enough. But then there were other moments. Like when Peter brought home a drawing he made at school, showing his family. Him, Michael, Richard and Helen, all holding hands. Or when Michael got his first good grade in math and ran to show Richard before anyone else. Or when both boys, without being asked, started calling Richard Dad. Frank continued with supervised visits for a few months, but after a relapse he stopped showing up. Richard didn't know if this was good or bad. The boys seemed relieved, but they also carried a sadness from being abandoned by their biological father for the second time. "It's not your fault," Richard would say whenever the subject came up. "Sometimes adults make bad decisions, but that doesn't mean you're not worthy of love." A year after the hearing, Richard and Helen were sitting in the audience at a school performance. The boys were on stage, Michael playing guitar in a music presentation, Peter singing in a children's choir. Both looked like normal kids, happy, secure. "We did it," whispered Helen, wiping away a tear. "We did," agreed Richard. And he realized it was true. He hadn't saved those children alone. It had been a collective effort. Him, Helen, Michelle, Amanda, even the school principal who believed in them, all working together to give Michael and Peter what they deserved, a chance. After the performance, as they walked back home, Peter held Richard's hand. "Dad," he said, and Richard still got chills every time he heard that word. "Do you remember the day we met you?" "Of course I remember. You were having lunch in the square, and we watched you for days before we had the courage to talk to you." "Why me?" "Because you looked sad," Peter said simply. "Just like us. And we thought maybe sad people could help each other become happy." Richard felt his throat tighten. From those young mouths came profound wisdom. They had chosen him not in spite of his sadness, but because of it, because they recognized a broken spirit and thought they could fix it together. And maybe they had. Because Richard no longer felt like that empty man who worked late to avoid going back to a lifeless apartment. He no longer felt like the man Catherine had left for being incapable of real connections. For the first time in years, he felt complete. That night, after putting the boys to bed, Richard stood in the doorway watching them sleep. Michael still kept a protective arm around Peter, even in his sleep, but now there was a peace on their faces that hadn't been there before. "Good night," whispered Richard. "Thank you for saving me too." And he closed the door gently, carrying in his heart the certainty that sometimes families aren't born from blood, but from choices, from courage, from two little boys who refused to give up, and from a man who learned that it's never too late to start over. End of story. And you, what did you think of this story? Did it touch you? Have you ever experienced something similar or know someone who lived through something like this? Tell us in the comments with sincere words. Do you believe Richard made the right decision? We'd love to read your opinion. Don't forget to leave your like, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other moving stories like this one.